On a quiet summer morning in 1968, Harlem gathered to bury a man most cities would have tried to erase. Bumpy Johnson died at breakfast, not in a hail of bullets, not in a prison cell, but as an old king who had already settled his accounts. Thousands came to the funeral. Politicians, musicians, shop owners, numbers runners, people whose lives had intersected with his rules, whether they liked him or not. Standing far from the spotlight, careful not to be noticed, was Frank Lucas. At that moment, Frank Lucas was already a legend in waiting, a man who would soon move more heroin than most crime families combined, a man whose empire would later be measured in millions per day. And yet, at that funeral, he wasn't powerful. He was cautious, quiet, almost invisible, because Frank wasn't there to celebrate a rival's death. He was there to face a debt that had never been paid. When the crowd thinned, Frank stepped forward. He leaned close to the casket and whispered something no one else heard. Not a threat, not a boast, an apology. To understand why one of America's most feared drug traffickers felt compelled to apologize to a dead man, you have to go back 3 years, to a moment when Frank Lucas believed the old rules no longer applied, when he thought speed mattered more than permission, when he mistook silence for weakness. This story isn't about a shootout, it isn't about revenge, and it isn't about who sold more drugs or made more money. It's about a single line that should never have been crossed, and what happens when someone ignores a warning given out of respect. Because what destroyed Frank Lucas's operation didn't come from the streets, or the police, or rival gangs. It came from one decision, one connection, and one phone call, placed by a man who understood that real power doesn't need to chase you. It just removes the ground beneath your feet. By the mid-1960s, Bumpy Johnson no longer needed to prove anything. He had survived prison, rivals, political pressure, and decades of shifting alliances. Harlem didn't follow him because they feared him. They followed him because the neighborhood functioned better when his rules were respected. And among all those rules, one stood above the rest. No hard drugs in Harlem. It wasn't a slogan, it wasn't a moral performance. It was a line drawn from experience. Bumpy had watched what heroin did to other cities long before it flooded New York streets. He'd seen blocks hollow out, families collapse, kids disappear into habits they couldn't afford and couldn't escape. Harlem, for all its hustle and underground economy, still had order. That order depended on limits. What made the rule powerful was not enforcement, it was consensus. Numbers, runners, shop owners, local crews, even outside organizations understood the arrangement. Harlem generated money in many ways, but it would not be sacrificed for one product that poisoned everything it touched. The Italian families accepted this reality not because Bumpy demanded it, but because stability was profitable. They sold heroin everywhere else. They left Harlem alone. That balance didn't happen by accident. It existed because Bumpy functioned as a regulator, not a tyrant. Disputes were settled quietly. Boundaries were reinforced without spectacle. People who ignored the rules didn't disappear immediately. They were corrected. And if they refused correction, they found themselves isolated. In Harlem, isolation was worse than confrontation. By 1965, Bumpy was nearly 60. Younger men mistook that for softness. They believed age meant detachment, that the neighborhood had outgrown the man who once held it together. What they failed to see was that time had only sharpened his understanding of leverage. Bumpy no longer reacted to problems. He anticipated them. That's why, when whispers began to circulate about a new product moving too freely on familiar corners, Bumpy didn't send muscle. He didn't raise alarms. He listened. He asked questions that sounded casual. He traced the pattern back to its source. And that source wasn't an outsider crashing the gate. It was someone who believed the rules were outdated, someone who thought ambition justified disruption, someone who confused opportunity with entitlement. Harlem had always tolerated hustlers. It did not tolerate those who endangered the ecosystem that kept everyone else alive. The rule against heroin wasn't about morality, it was about survival. And the moment that rule was challenged, the response was never going to be loud, it was going to be precise. When Frank Lucas looked at Harlem in the early 1960s, he didn't see tradition. He saw inefficiency. He had spent years doing the work nobody remembered. Running errands, moving money, enforcing decisions made by older men who controlled access but not imagination. To Frank, the problem wasn't loyalty, it was scale. Harlem was crowded with rules, but rules didn't pay what ambition demanded. Frank believed the era itself was on his side. The war overseas had cracked open roots nobody in New York fully understood yet. Supply chains stretched farther than family names. Middlemen inflated prices, diluted product, and slowed everything down. Frank's insight was simple and dangerous. If the system could be bypassed, the old gatekeepers would become irrelevant. He didn't think of himself as reckless. He thought of himself as efficient. The mistake wasn't the product. It was the assumption that speed equals superiority. Frank moved as if being first mattered more than being permitted. He trusted purity, price, and momentum to protect him. Customers would follow quality. Dealers would follow money. And once the machine was running, he believed no one would dare stop it without exposing themselves to chaos. That belief made him confident. Confidence made him dismissive. Frank knew about Bumpy's rule, everyone did. But to Frank, it sounded like something that belonged to another decade, a moral position disguised as control. He told himself that communities changed, markets evolved, and that Harlem could absorb anything if the cash kept flowing. He convinced himself that resistance would soften once profits became visible. What he didn't understand was that Harlem wasn't a market in the way he imagined. It was a network of dependencies. Families, storefronts, quiet agreements. The rule against heroin wasn't sentimental, it was structural. Remove it, and the entire balance shifted. Frank saw growth. Bumpy saw erosion. The more Frank succeeded, the more certain he became that the old guard had misread the future. He interpreted silence as hesitation, a lack of immediate retaliation as consent. Each uninterrupted day reinforced the idea that he was operating in a new world where permission no longer mattered. That's when the illusion locked in. Frank assumed that if conflict came, it would be obvious. A warning delivered loudly, a threat made publicly, a move that required response. He was prepared for confrontation. What he wasn't prepared for was correction without noise, pressure without fingerprints, resistance that didn't look like resistance at all. By the time Frank realized that Harlem hadn't accepted his operation, it had already begun to close around it. Not with force. With absence. Calls unanswered. Doors not opened. Risks recalculated by people who suddenly decided the future Frank promised wasn't worth the cost. Frank believed he was playing a faster game. What he failed to see was that he had entered a deeper one, governed by rules he chose to ignore, enforced by a man who no longer needed to announce himself. And once that game began, speed stopped being an advantage. The first conversation wasn't meant to intimidate. That's what made it dangerous. When Bumpy Johnson asked Frank Lucas to sit down with him, it wasn't framed as discipline or judgment. It was framed as guidance. Two men at different stages of the same path, sharing a table instead of a battlefield. No raised voices, no audience. Just a quiet reminder that Harlem had boundaries, and those boundaries existed for reasons bigger than ego. Bumpy didn't speak like a man protecting territory. He spoke like someone protecting systems. He explained what Frank was disrupting without dramatizing it. He didn't accuse Frank of greed or disrespect. He simply made the line visible. Take the business elsewhere. Expand all you want, just not here. For most men, that would have been enough. Harlem understood tone. A calm warning delivered privately carried more weight than public humiliation. But Frank heard something else entirely. He heard hesitation. He heard age. He heard a man negotiating with the future instead of commanding it. That misinterpretation hardened quickly. Frank responded with the language of efficiency and inevitability. People wanted the product. Money was flowing. Nothing had collapsed yet. In his mind, that was proof. He believed outcomes justified disruption, and that resistance would fade once everyone adjusted to the new normal. He mistook restraint for uncertainty. What Frank didn't recognize was that Bumpy wasn't asking him to stop because he lacked leverage. He was offering Frank an exit because leverage didn't need to be demonstrated. In Harlem, leverage lived in relationships, not threats, and once those relationships shifted, no amount of cash could realign them. The second conversation came soon after, and it was shorter. Bumpy didn't repeat himself. He didn't escalate theatrically. He clarified consequence. Not in terms of punishment, but in terms of trajectory. Continue down this road, and you won't like where it ends. It wasn't prophecy. It was logistics. A simple explanation of cause and effect delivered without emotion. Frank heard it as an old man clinging to relevance. That was the mistake. Warnings are only wasted on people who think the future belongs to them by default. Frank believed momentum would protect him. That success itself created immunity. He didn't understand that in Harlem, momentum without alignment was fragile. It looked impressive right up until it vanished. When Frank left that table, he wasn't scared. He was confident. Confident enough to expand faster. Confident enough to test the boundary one more time. He believed that if Bumpy were truly dangerous, he would have already acted. He didn't realize that action had already begun, just not where he was looking. Because the most effective warnings don't tell you what will happen. They give you a chance to stop it before you feel it, and once that chance passes, the correction doesn't announce itself. It simply unfolds. What followed wasn't retaliation, it was subtraction. Bumpy Johnson didn't aim at Frank directly because Frank himself wasn't the engine. He was the operator sitting on top of an arrangement that only worked as long as every piece stayed in place. Suppliers answered calls, routes stayed open, dealers felt protected. Cash moved without friction. Remove any one of those, and the rest would wobble. Remove them in sequence, and the whole thing would fall without a sound. It began quietly, with a single connection reconsidering a risk, then another, and another. Not because anyone was threatened, but because the environment changed. Questions started appearing where certainty had been. The kind of questions that make people pause before returning calls, delay meetings, and reassess who they're actually exposed to. By the second day, the flow slowed. By the third, it stalled. Frank didn't notice at first. He assumed delays were temporary. Logistics always had friction. But what he didn't understand was that this wasn't friction. It was withdrawal. The people who made his operation possible weren't defecting to a rival. They weren't being bought. They were stepping back simultaneously, independently for the same reason. The future suddenly looked dangerous. That's how you know pressure is real. It doesn't push people toward alternatives. It makes them choose absence. By midweek, distribution was unstable. Dealers stopped answering. Not because they'd been scared, but because they'd been informed. In Harlem, information traveled faster than product, and once the idea settled that protection was no longer guaranteed, loyalty recalculated itself. Money could be replaced. Consequences could not. Frank tried to tighten control, but control requires visibility. The more he reached out, the clearer it became that the network had thinned. He wasn't being resisted. He was being left. By the end of the week, the structure he'd built had no center, no reliable intake, no consistent output. Cash stopped circulating. Locations became liabilities. Silence replaced routine. The system didn't explode. It evaporated. That's when Frank finally understood what had happened. He hadn't been beaten by force. He hadn't been exposed publicly. He hadn't even been confronted again. He'd been disconnected. Every advantage he believed made him untouchable depended on relationships he didn't control, and those relationships had quietly realigned. The message arrived last because it didn't need to arrive sooner. Short, unsigned, unmistakable. You're still breathing. That's the warning. Frank didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue with. The game hadn't turned against him. It had moved on without him. And in Harlem, when the system decides you're no longer compatible, survival means leaving before the absence becomes permanent. By the seventh day, the empire existed only in memory, and the lesson was complete. Power isn't proven by what you can build quickly, but by how fast everything collapses when the right person decides it's time. Frank didn't leave Harlem in panic. He left in clarity. When Frank Lucas finally accepted what had happened, there was no rage left to fuel resistance. Rage needs an opponent. What he faced now was absence. No suppliers willing to answer. No dealers eager to risk the fallout. No quiet assurances that tomorrow would look like yesterday. Harlem hadn't turned hostile. It had turned closed. That distinction mattered. Frank understood violence. He could plan for it. He could counter it. But closure offered no leverage. You can't intimidate a system that has already decided you don't belong. You can't negotiate with people who aren't picking up the phone. And you can't rebuild momentum when every path forward leads to exposure. So he did the only rational thing left. He removed himself. There was no dramatic escape, no last stand, no attempt to reclaim ground. Just a bag packed lightly, routes chosen carefully, and the decision to become invisible. Harlem didn't chase him. It didn't need to. Exile works best when it feels voluntary, when the person leaving understands that staying would be worse. That was the final lesson. Bumpy Johnson didn't win by humiliating Frank. Humiliation creates grudges. Grudges return with time. What Bumpy enforced was a boundary so complete that it removed the desire to retaliate. Frank wasn't angry at Bumpy, he was impressed. And that impression lasted longer than fear ever could. Away from Harlem, Frank replayed the sequence over and over. Not the warning, not the conversations, the speed. How quickly everything had unraveled once alignment disappeared. How a system that looked unstoppable collapsed the moment the right connections withdrew their consent. Years later, Frank would build again, bigger, louder, richer, but never the same way. He never forgot that power wasn't about dominance. It was about permission, about knowing which rules could bend and which ones, once broken, erased you from the board entirely. Harlem remained what it had been before he arrived. Structured, cautious, and intact. No victory parade, no announcement, just continuity. And sometimes continuity is the clearest sign of who really won. Years later, when people talked about Frank Lucas, they talked about money, about scale, about how fast he rose and how loudly he fell. But Frank himself never measured his life that way. The moment that stayed with him wasn't the height of his empire or the day it collapsed in court. It was the week he was erased without a single blow being struck. That was when he understood the difference between power and momentum. Momentum looks unstoppable until it isn't. It depends on speed, appetite, and constant expansion. Power doesn't. Power sits inside systems. It lives in relationships that don't announce themselves. And when power moves, it doesn't rush you. It simply removes your ability to keep going. Bumpy Johnson never tried to out-earn Frank. He never tried to out-threaten him. He didn't need to. He understood that Harlem wasn't a prize to be conquered, but an ecosystem to be protected. And anyone who endangered that ecosystem, no matter how ambitious, no matter how profitable, would eventually be corrected. Frank learned that lesson too late to avoid exile, but early enough to survive it. That's why, standing at Bumpy's funeral, Frank didn't feel relief. He felt recognition. He was looking at a man who had controlled outcomes long after people stopped noticing the hand behind them. A man whose authority didn't end with his heartbeat, because it had already been built into the city itself. This story isn't about crime. It's about structure. About why the most dangerous people are rarely the loudest ones in the room. They're the ones who understand exactly how things fit together, and exactly which thread to pull when someone mistakes opportunity for entitlement. In the end, Frank Lucas became famous. Bumpy Johnson became permanent, and Harlem never confused the two.